Have you ever been pushed so far that you decided to stop playing fair and play smart instead? That's exactly what happened to me when my so-called neighbors in the Homeowners Association decided they could control my life. My name's David. I live on a ranch that's been in my family for 3 generations. It's nothing flashy, just wide open land, some cattle, a barn, and the dirt road that cuts right through the HOA's neighborhood. That dirt road is more than just a path, it's the only access point to my ranch. Without it, I'd be stranded now. I never wanted trouble. I kept to myself. I fixed my fences, paid my bills, and minded my own business. But apparently, the HOA had a different idea. They saw me as an outsider. Someone who didn't fit in with their perfectly trimmed lawns, identical houses, and endless rules about mailbox heights and the color of your garage door. And one morning, out of nowhere, they decided to teach me a lesson. When I drove back from town, I saw it. A brand new fence steel, tall, lock stretching across the only road to my ranch. Right in front of my truck. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely no one would be crazy enough to block someone's only access to their own property. But when I got out and checked, I saw the shiny HOA sign screwed into the gate. Private HOA property. No access without authorization. I stood there, gripping the metal, my blood boiling. I had no authorization. And this was my only road. At that moment, I realized something. This wasn't a mistake. This was war. The HOA board president, a smug guy named Richard, strolled up from the cul-de-sac like he had been waiting for me. He was one of those types who always wore pressed polo shirts and carried himself like he was the king of the neighborhood. "Sorry, David," he said with a fake smile. "New HOA policy. Can't have random trucks tearing through here. Lowers property values." Clenched my fists. Random trucks. "Richard, this is the only access road to my land. You can't just fence it off." "Oh, I think we can," he replied smoothly. "See, the road technically cuts through HOA jurisdiction, which means access can be regulated. But don't worry, I'm sure we can come to an arrangement." I knew exactly what he meant. Richard wanted money. They didn't want me gone. They wanted me paying their HOA fees like everyone else. That night, I sat on my porch, staring out at the stars. My cattle lowing in the distance, my dog curled up by my boots. I felt trapped, literally fenced in. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. The HOA thought they had outsmarted me, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. This wasn't the end of my ranch. This was the beginning of their worst nightmare. Asterisk, asterisk, when I woke up the next morning. The first thing I did was walk back to that gate. And sure enough, there it stood, cold steel, shining in the morning light. Like a wall, daring me to defy it. But what got me wasn't the gate itself. It was the lock. Heavy duty, brand new, with a fresh coat of paint. The HOA hadn't just put up a fence. They wanted me to know this wasn't temporary. This was permanent. I stood there for a long time, running my hand along the bars, listening to the quiet hum of the suburb beyond. Lawn sprinklers ticking, a kid's bike rattling on the pavement, the faint sound of a car door slamming. Life was normal for them. For me, my entire world had just been sealed shut. I went around the long way, hiking through brush and overgrown land until I got to the county office. I figured surely the law had to be on my side. A man can't be blocked from his own property, but the county clerk, a tired woman with glasses perched low on her nose, shook her head after looking over some documents. "Technically," she said, "the road does pass through HOA jurisdiction. It's murky, but they can regulate access." My stomach dropped. "So you're telling me I can't get to my own land?" She sighed. "I'm saying it'll take time. Lawyers, permits, court hearings. Months, maybe even years. In the meantime, she shrugged. Maybe you should try negotiating with them. Negotiating. That word left a bitter taste in my mouth. Because I already knew what negotiation meant with Richard and his HOA goons. It meant paying fees. It meant playing by their rules. It meant becoming exactly what they wanted me to be, controlled. When I got back to the ranch, I saw Richard standing by the gate again, this time with 2 other board members. One was a woman in a sun hat, the other a tall guy with a clipboard. They looked like they were inspecting something, nodding and scribbling notes. I parked my truck, walked up, and forced myself to keep my voice calm. What exactly do you people think you're doing? Richard smirked. Routine inspection. Making sure everything's in order. Safety standards, you know? Safety standards for a fence you had no right to build. I shot back. The woman in the sun hat gave a fake laugh. Oh, David, don't be so dramatic. You can always apply for access. We'll review your request at the next HOA meeting. If approved, you'll get a key. Simple as that. And what's the catch? I asked. The tall guy with the clipboard glanced up. HOA dues. Annual compliance fees, plus a property improvement bond, since your ranch is technically adjacent to the community. Standard procedure. I felt my blood pressure rising. They were treating me like some tenant, begging for permission just to use what had always been mine. But I didn't shout. I didn't argue. Instead, I nodded slowly. Got it? I'll think about it. And as I walked back to my truck, I could hear Richard chuckle behind me. That sound stuck in my head the whole drive home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at old family photos pinned on the wall. My father, my grandfather, all standing proud on this same land. They had built this ranch from the ground up. They had fought through droughts, storms, and debt. And now, some HOA thought they could just fence me out. No, this wasn't going to end with me cutting a check and handing it over to Richard. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, then fine. I could play dirtier. The next morning, I drove into town again. But this time, not to see lawyers or county clerks. This time, I visited an old friend, Sam. Sam ran a construction company. We'd gone to school together, and he owed me a favor. Years ago, when his truck broke down in the middle of nowhere, I was the one who hauled him out. When I explained the situation, Sam leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. So let me get this straight. They blocked your only road. Yep, and they're trying to force you into paying HOA dues. Exactly, he chuckled, shaking his head. That's low, even for an HOA. I leaned forward. I need to build something. Not on my land and theirs. Right at that gate. Sam raised an eyebrow. You're thinking about cutting through? No, I said with a slow grin. I'm thinking about turning their little stunt into an opportunity. You know how they're all about their private community. Well, maybe it's time they learn what private really means. Sam smirked. You've got that look in your eye, David. The last time you had that look, we ended up dragging a hot tub into the middle of Main Street. We both laughed, but then I grew serious. This isn't a prank, Sam. This is about principle. They want to block me out. Fine, but if they want to use that gate, they're going to have to pay for it. Sam's eyes widened. Wait, you're talking about a toll road? I nodded. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Of course, it wasn't that simple. I couldn't just throw up a toll booth overnight and start charging people. I needed a plan. And more importantly, I needed leverage, because right now, the HOA had the upper hand. They had the law, the money, and the numbers. But they also had one fatal flaw: arrogance. They thought they had one, which meant they'd never see me coming. For the next few days, I kept quiet. I let them think I was defeated. I drove my truck around the long way when I needed to get to town, hauling supplies through rough dirt trails that scratched up the paint and rattled the suspension. I waved politely when I saw the board members. I even pretended to look over the HOA's paperwork. But behind the scenes, setting everything in motion, Sam agreed to help me design the structure. I started ordering materials: wood, metal, even a solar-powered payment system that could be installed discreetly. And all the while, I kept track of every single car that passed through that gate. SUVs, minivans, delivery trucks. HOA members loved their convenience. That gate was their lifeline. And soon, it would be my payday. But here's the thing about revenge. It never goes smoothly. The HOA wasn't done with me yet. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, I heard voices outside my ranch. Loud, sharp, angry voices. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. There they were, Richard and 3 other board members, standing just past the fence line, pointing at my barn. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I called out. Richard smirked, the beam of my flashlight catching the smug curve of his lips. "Routine property review," he said. "We noticed your barn doesn't meet updated fire safety codes." That could be a violation. My jaw clenched. "You've never cared about my barn before? Things change," he said simply. "We'll be sending a notice. Might be a hefty fine if you don't bring it up to standard." They turned and walked away, laughing under their breath. And right then, as I watched them disappear into the dark, my plan shifted from an idea to a mission. This wasn't just about blocking my road anymore. This was about respect. And I was going to make damn sure the HOA learned the hard way. There's a strange kind of calm that comes right before you do something you know you shouldn't. And yet you're going to do it anyway. Maybe it's the silence. Maybe it's the focus. For me, it felt like the world tightened around that one idea. Turn their gate into a toll. I couldn't risk doing it openly. The moment the HOA smelled trouble, they'd call the sheriff, file an injunction. Or worse, cut me off permanently with some ordinance or easement claim. So everything had to be quiet, clever, and built on the margins of what they couldn't immediately prove. Sam and I worked nights. We'd meet out near the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction, under the orange spill of my pickup truck's lights, with plans spread on the hood and coffee gone cold. Sam had a knack for engineering things that looked innocent until you needed them to be anything but. He measured the shoulder, mapped the sightlines, counted the cars that came and went at different hours. He taught me how to read the neighborhood's rhythm when most people left for work, when kids got home from school, when the mail truck made its rounds. By week 2, we had a blueprint that would do more than just charge a fee. It would make a statement. Step 1. A disguised toll booth. It would look like a maintenance kiosk, a weathered wooden shed with a small solar panel and a tiny light. Inside, a simple arm gate, heavy but nondescript. Step 2. A payment system that looked like a charity drop box from a distance. QR codes. A slot for cash receipts, a cell phone link for card payments. No big signs, no flashy lights. Subtlety was our friend. Step 3 was the clever part. We installed a crude but reliable car counting system using pressure plates hidden under gravel. Nothing high-tech the HOA inspector would squeal over, but enough to know how many cars passed on any given day. We also set up a weatherproof camera with a looped power cable that ran deep into the brush. The camera wasn't for social media, it was for leverage. If Richard claimed the gate was on HOA land, I wanted footage proving how files, trucks, and even construction crews moved in and out through that fence. I wanted receipts. I wanted proof they were using the gate as much as they expected me to. We worked fast. We borrowed tools, traded favors, paid cash when needed. The shed grew out of salvaged planks and an old shipping pallet I found behind Sam's shop. A rusty sign that once read "Community Maintenance" fit perfectly on the front. We anchored the arm gate with rebar and reinforced hinges, so it wouldn't become a flimsy toy someone could kick open at night. There were nights I thought we'd be caught. One evening, halfway through bolting the arm into place, headlights swept across the trees. A patrol car. I froze, heart in my throat. Sam's hand tightened on my shoulder. We stayed still under the tarp like two bushes. The car rolled by with the radio faint and the officer's silhouette hunched forward. Whoever was inside didn't bother with the gate. They turned down the cul-de-sac and drove off. We waited a good 10 minutes after the taillights blinked out. Before we moved again, the first time we tested the toll was accidental. I had to get into town for a part that Sam promised to pick up but had forgotten at the shop. I drove the truck down that rutted path at dawn. My toolbox in the bed and a bag of donuts for Sam. The shed stood quiet, the arm raised. For the hell of it, I ran a hand across the QR sticker we'd glued onto a side plank. It flashed private access pay to proceed, in small type that only a second glance would catch. A truck that morning, a landscaper's pickup, slowed. The driver peered at the small sign, shrugged, and tossed a few bills into the slot as he passed. I nearly laughed out loud. $10. It sounded ridiculous, but the principle hit me like a shot of adrenaline. Money, even nickels and dimes, was a language the HOA understood. I didn't try to hide the fact we were operating. We weren't hiding from neighbors. We were hiding from the HOA's legal department. The whole thing was bold in its humility. It looked like seasonal maintenance. It smelled like an old charity stand. It was easier to dismiss than a barricade. Word spreads quick in small communities. Within days, a handful of cars, delivery vans, a real estate agent's sedan, Mrs. Harlan's minivan had nudged their way through the gate, each paying the small fee. Some paid because they were embarrassed by the sight of change. Some because they didn't care, and some simply because convenience beat principle. Every time my phone pinged with a payment notification, 50 cents, $10, $3. None of it was substantial alone, but every payment was a tiny victory. A thumb in the eye of the board that thought they could squeeze me out. But triumph came with complications. On the third week, I noticed a pattern. Richard began scheduling more inspections, appearing at odd hours, hovering near the gate, pretending to scribble notes on his clipboard. He started asking neighbors about suspicious activity near the property line. I could feel his eyes across the tree line, like the weight of a judge's stare. He couldn't find anything concrete, but he was rattled, and that rattled him into mistakes. His first mistake was a public meeting he called with the board. I knew about it because Mrs. Harlan, the neighbor who'd paid the toll twice just to avoid fuss, warned me that Richard was bragging to the board about narrowing down who'd been near the gate. I didn't want to attend. I didn't want to appear menacing or escalate directly. But Sam insisted I go not to confront Richard, but to listen. He thought a public board would reveal something stupid that Richard might say on the record. Sam was right. The meeting was a theater of small grievances. Lawn complaints, mailbox hype proposals, debates about the color of decorative rocks. Then Richard stood up, all polished confidence, and announced a security concern about recent unauthorized structures near the community boundary. He asked the board to consider an amount to allocate for heavy-duty cameras and to authorize legal counsel to pursue trespass claims if necessary. He mentioned a small toll booth in passing. But when he said it, his voice tightened. The way he rolled the words told me he had no evidence, only suspicion. A leak of anger. After the meeting, neighbors milled about and whispered. Some were bothered. Some thought it was petty. A handful, quietly, came up to me and said what I already knew. They didn't agree with how Richard handled things. That's when I realized one of our most underused assets wasn't wood or metal or surveillance. It was people. Even in a community built of conformity, not everyone liked being bossed around. One neighbor. An elderly man named Joe, who'd lived 2 houses down from me before the HOA reconfigured the plots, had a different kind of anger. Joe's wife had passed the year before, and the HOA had been merciless about removing a homemade bird feeder he'd hung on his fence. He walked up to me, leaned on his cane, and said, "If you got a mind to teach Em something, son, don't let me fade away complaining. I'll back you." I felt something warm in my chest. This wasn't just my fight anymore, but arrogance breeds retaliation. Richard, smart as he fancied himself, wasn't content with passive motions. One morning, I found a notice nailed to my barn. HOA complaint filed, non-compliance with aesthetic covenant. The notice read like a lawsuit in bullet points. It complained about a storage of commercial materials, our lumber, exposed waste, and the kicker, unauthorized commercial activity. They were accusing me of running a pay-for-access operation. My laugh that day was half hysteria, half fury. They were weaponizing paperwork, the thing bureaucrats hide behind. I called Sam, we looked over the notice, and we weren't worried about the administrative complaint, not yet. But the letter signaled escalation. Someone had gone through the trouble to draw attorneys into the loop. Someone had decided to try to make the toll illegal on paper before they could stop it in practice. We adjusted. We moved the visible parts of the operation deeper into the brush. The shed stayed, but the solar panel and payment chute were masked more cleverly. We added a few decoy elements to make it look like seasonal maintenance for a walking path. The pressure plates were camouflaged more thoroughly. We tightened our camera's angle, added redundancy to the power system. Every step forward came with a small countermeasure to an imagined next step. And while the HOA filed paperwork, life continued in that little corner of the world. People still drove, still paid a few dollars for convenience, still muttered about lawn chairs and property values. Our stream of tiny payments continued to tick in. They were insignificant in a bank ledger, but to me, they were proof. I could turn inconvenience into leverage. I could turn pride into profit. I could turn arrogance into accountability. Then came the night that cracked Maru. Then came the night that changed everything. It was raining hard, one of those sheets of rain nights that Tace had made. Erases tire tracks and leaves only a smell of wet earth. I was watching footage from the camera, half asleep on the office floor, when a van slowed at the gate. The footage was grainy, the headlights bright. 2 men climbed out. They wore dark jackets and moved with a purpose that made my teeth ache. They had tools, and they were looking not like regular neighbors, but like men sent to do a job. They circled the shed, peered under gravel, inspected the arm. One of them muttered something into a phone. I sat upright so fast, the chair squealed. If Richard had hired people to sabotage the operation, he'd finally crossed a line I couldn't just ignore. I grabbed my jacket, told Sam to meet me with the truck, and drove out into the rain. We hit the skid marks on the shoulder, lights cutting through sheets of water. The men were still there, but so was the van. They hadn't gotten to the arm, but they dug around the pressure plates. They were trying to find the mechanism. They looked up as we approached. "Can I help you, fellas?" I called, my voice louder than I intended. They straightened, trying on innocence. One of them, taller, smiled like he was auditioning for a role. "Just giving some advice," he said. "Looks like you got a hazard with that setup. Could cause accidents." Sam pulled up beside me, voice low. "Who sent you?" The men traded glances. The taller one's smile thinned. "Doesn't matter who sent us, friend. Just looking out for the neighborhood." That night, standing in the rain with gravel under my boots, I realized how far this could go. This wasn't a small HOA slap anymore. They were testing limits, sending men in the dark to intimidate. They wanted the toll gone, and perhaps to make sure I knew I'd be the one paying the cost for stepping out of line. But as much as the rain soaked my shirt, it couldn't wash away the truth. We'd already gotten past the point of no return. Once you start a thing like this, once you hold a mirror up to people who like to pretend nothing is wrong, you can't back down. Not now. Not when Joe and the others were quietly watching. Not when that footage existed on hard drives in my truck. We tightened the bolt on the arm so it wouldn't be easily removed. We added a decoy alarm that could be tripped and broadcast aloud. Old-fashioned bell, not enough to call the police, but enough to make anyone working in the dark think twice. And we started printing laminated cards with a polite message. Private access, respectfully requesting payment for continued use. A small, civil preface to the tantrums and lawsuits that were sure to come by the time we crawled back into the truck. The rain had stopped and steam rose from the dirt like ghosts. In the rear view, the gate looked small and ridiculous and oddly triumphant. The payments chimed in my phone again. 2 more, one for $5, one for $2. They felt like a heartbeat. I started to understand something about human nature. People will grumble about principle, but convenience wins. Pride will be compromised when the path of least resistance comes with a price, even if the price is small. And an HOA that relies on compliance will find it much harder to maintain when the compliance is optional. That night, soaked and exhausted, I sat and watched the camera footage again. But this time, I didn't watch the men in the rain. I watched the faces of the people who passed through the gate later. The mail carrier who hesitated and then smiled at the old decoy sign before passing through. The neighbor who stuck his head out the window to toss a note into the slot and left. They weren't villains. They were neighbors. And that made what I was doing feel complicated in a way I hadn't expected. But complicated didn't mean wrong. If anything, it made me more determined. If the HOA wanted a war of rules, I'd wage one of rules and reveal, along the way, every contradiction in their castle of neat lawns and tidy forms. And as the night wound down, I realized the toll hadn't just been about money. It had been about control. About who decided the terms of living in a place. And for the first time since they put up that fence, felt like I'd taken something back. Asterisk, the rain washed away the tracks that night, but not the feeling. That visit those men creeping around the gate stuck with me. It wasn't just intimidation. It was a warning shot. Richard wasn't bluffing anymore. By the next morning, the real strike landed. I found a thick envelope in my mailbox, stamped with the logo of a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a notice of violation and cease and desist. According to the letter, I was engaged in unauthorized commercial activity on HOA property. They demanded I immediately dismantle the toll collection structure and cease soliciting payments if I didn't comply. They threatened fines up to $500 per day and possible civil litigation. It was exactly the kind of heavy-handed nonsense I expected. I laughed when I read it, but it was the kind of laugh that doesn't come from humor. More from the edge of frustration where anger turns sharp. I called Sam, and he came over that afternoon. He read through the letter, snorted, and tossed it onto the table. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said. "That toll's not technically on their property line. You've got maps to prove it." "Yeah," I muttered, staring out the window toward the ridge where the gate stood. "But maps don't stop lawsuits. They'll drag me into court just to bleed me dry." "Oh God." Sam shrugged. "Then you hit back before they do." That's when an idea took root. I didn't need to beat the HOA in court. I didn't even need to dismantle them legally. I just needed to show everyone what kind of people they really were. It started small. I compiled the camera footage. Hours and hours of cars passing through that gate, neighbors, delivery trucks, realtors, even the HOA board members themselves. Every one of them using the very gate they claimed was off limits. Some paid the toll, some didn't. But the principle was clear. The gate wasn't private. It was public when it suited them, private when it didn't, single quotes. Next, started talking to people, not in a fiery, confrontational way, but in a calm, almost casual tone. At the grocery store, at the feed shop, even at the diner in town. I'd bring it up, the HOA blocked me off my own land. I had to build a toll just to keep things fair. They use it themselves, even while threatening me. It didn't take long for whispers to spread. In small towns, stories travel faster than any lawyer's letter. And the thing about an HOA is, not everyone loves them. Some comply out of fear, some out of habit. But plenty of people resent being told what kind of flowers they can plant in their yard. Soon, people were calling me directly, Mrs. Harlan. With her sun hat and her quiet sympathy, came by with lemonade and a warning. "Richard's furious," she whispered, glancing around like spies might be hiding in the hay bales. "He's been calling emergency board meetings about you. He says you're setting a dangerous precedent." I smirked. Dangerous precedent. What? Independent thought. But she didn't smile. "Be careful, David. They're talking about petitioning the county to revoke your property easement altogether." That hit me in the gut. If they managed that, if the county sided with them, I wouldn't just lose the road. I'd lose everything. That night, I sat on the porch with my old dog at my feet, staring at the gate's faint silhouette against the moonlight. I thought about my grandfather, who cleared this land with his own hands. I thought about my father, who rebuilt the barn after a fire nearly took it all. They never gave up when things got hard. Neither would I. I poured myself a strong coffee, pulled out the county maps, and started tracing. Roads, easements, property lines. That's when I saw it, a detail I hadn't paid much attention to before. The gate sat on a narrow strip of squally owned. It was classified as a shared access corridor, a leftover from when the land was first parceled decades ago. The HOA managed it, but they didn't own it outright, which meant their entire fence and private property claim. Built on shaky ground, I could fight them legally, yes. But I had a better idea. 2 days later, I showed up at the next HOA meeting. I didn't announce myself. I just walked in, sat down in the back, and listened. Richard was in rare form. He stood at the front of the room, waving papers, his voice loud and booming. "This rancher thinks he can defy our bylaws. He's turned our gate into his personal cash grab. If we let this stand, what's next? Food trucks in the cul-de-sac. Carnival rides on the greenbelt." Some people nodded. Some looked bored. And a few, I noticed, looked skeptical. That's when I stood up. "Funny thing about that gate," I said loudly enough to cut through the chatter. Every head turned. Richard froze, his jaw tightening. "Funny thing is," I continued, "you've all been using it? I've got the footage. Delivery trucks, realtors, even board members. Paying the toll, not paying the toll, doesn't matter. You're all using the road you claim is private." Gasps and whispers rippled through the room. Richard's face went red. "Out of order," he barked. "You don't have the floor, David." I ignored him. And here's the kicker. That gate, that fence, built on a shared access corridor, which means you don't actually own it. You can manage it, sure, but you don't get to block me or anyone else out of it completely. The room erupted. Some people murmured angrily, others asked questions, and a few actually applauded. Richard banged his gavel so hard it cracked. Meeting adjourned. He shouted, but the damage was already done. The seed had been planted. Over the next week, the split in the neighborhood grew sharper. Some neighbors sided with Richard, calling me a troublemaker. Others quietly thanked me, some even slipping small donations into the toll slot as a gesture of support. The more Richard tried to tighten his grip, the more cracks appeared in his kingdom of order. But with cracks came danger. One night, I found my barn door open. Tools missing. A generator gone. no note, no witnesses. Just silence. It was clear enough. Richard and his allies weren't done playing dirty. But neither was I, because if they wanted to escalate this into sabotage and threats, I had one card left to play. A card that could turn the toll road from a nuisance into a weapon. And trust me, I was ready to play it. When you're pushed into a corner, you can either curl up and wait for the boot, or you can learn how to aim. I spent the week after the break, not raging, not panicking. I was planning. The barn theft changed my risk tolerance. Before that, I'd played clever games, hidden cameras, pressure plates, polite laminated cards, and a weathered shed that looked like a maintenance kiosk. Those moves were fine for poking and prodding. They were good for proving points and collecting a trickle of cash. But the barn hit was different. Someone was willing to cross lines to hurt me. That meant I couldn't keep playing coy. If they were going to escalate, I needed something that did more than embarrass the board. I needed leverage that could not be ignored, erased, or filed away under administrative nuisance. So I made a decision. I was going to weaponize the toll, not by turning it into something violent or illegal, but by turning it into a mirror. Everything the HOA used to hide its hypocrisy, I would show on full display. And I'd make sure the public, the county, neighbors, and anyone with a phone saw it. The first step was transparency. If the board had lawyers, I'd get a lawyer too. If they had meetings behind closed doors, I'd build a public record. If they thought paper could bury truth, I'd print my own. I used the small payments to fund the next moves. It wasn't a lot, $5, $10, $20 here and there, but it became a war chest. I hired a decent local attorney on a contingency retainer. Nothing fancy, but someone who knew county codes and how to shake loose records. I bought extra memory cards for the cameras. I rented a second, more powerful spotlight that could be set to motion sensor mode and wasn't easily mistaken for a porch light. I paid Sam enough to keep him focused and willing to work nights in the cold. Then I worked the human angles. People hate bullies, but they love a story with a clear villain and a clear victim. Richard thought his job was to intimidate. He didn't account for the fact that when someone goes after a man's land, the man becomes a story. I told my story. Not dramatic, not melodramatic, just the facts. The fence. The notice. The men in the rain. The break-in. The county clerk who shrugged. The board's letters. The footage. People listened. Some out of curiosity, some out of spite against the HOA's petty rules. A few neighbors who'd quietly paid the toll, meanwhile, started dropping by with little contributions. A roll of duct tape. A spare generator. A casserole. A handwritten note that said, "Keep going." When Mrs. Harlan winked and slipped an envelope into my hand, I realized how many small rebellions can add up. Now came the sting. I set the camera system to stream a low-resolution feed to a secure server Sam and I controlled. It was crude, but good enough. We picked a night when we knew many people would be at home and made sure. The feed would buffer long enough that someone could pull it up and watch. I called a reporter from the county paper not to burn bridges or make threats, but to make sure there was an eyewitness who could corroborate anything that happened. He agreed to come by under the pretense of a community interest story. He'd sit in his car and be ready. I didn't promise him drama. I only promised him a story. The plan was simple: bait and record. I would make the shed and the arm visible, but still unassuming. I'd post a polite sign, publicly readable, non-threatening. I would monitor. If anyone tried to sabotage the mechanism, if anyone came with tools and intent, we'd capture it live. The footage would go to the reporter, to my lawyer, and to the county. No gray lines, just evidence. The night we picked was warm and still. The kind that makes people comfortable enough to let their guard down. I set the motion-activated spotlight and left the front porch light off. Sam sat in my pickup with his laptop, the reporter idling 2 houses over in an unmarked car, and a small group of neighbors, Joe among them, parked down the road in quiet support. Around midnight, a truck rolled up. Not the van from before, but a different vehicle, a black Ford with tinted windows. 2 men climbed out, casual at first, carrying a come-along and a toolbox. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. They went straight to the arm. They weren't hiding. They were methodical. Sam's hand hit the radio. They're there. I felt nothing at first, that weird, hollow sensation I'd felt before when things are about to split open. Then adrenaline, like a rope pulling tight, and decisions crystallized. I switched on the spotlight. The sudden beam painted them in stark white. They froze like deer caught at a farm gate. The camera caught every move. One of them turned, hands open in a casual, pleading gesture, as if he had been doing the favor for the HOA and not acting as hired muscle. "Evening, fellas," I called from the dark. My voice was calm. "You lost?" The taller one put a hand to his chest, trying to act surprised. "Just checking on safety," he lied. "Looks like a trip hazard, sir." "Funny way to inspect a trip hazard," I said. "Care to share who hired you?" They didn't answer. Instead, the shorter one tried to wrench at the arm. I stepped forward, hands visible, and shouted, "Stop." They paused. The longer they paused, the more ridiculous the charade looked. The men in the truck were not honest contractors. They were hired hands. The camera recorded the license plate as it idled. The reporter, seeing live footage, called out, "We're recording everything. Stop, or we call the sheriff." That's when they moved. Not to flee, but to bluff. The taller man shoved at the arm, trying to force it open. It didn't budge. The anchor bolts held. The decoy bell I'd wired to the motion sensor clamored like an old church bell. Dogs started barking down the block. Joe's headlights flicked on. The men looked frightened, then angry, then thirsty for the safety of the truck. They climbed back in and peeled out, tires screaming on gravel. Next morning, the county paper ran with a photo. The black truck. The motion light glare. A headline that didn't need much flourish. Local rancher alleges intimidation at HOA gate. Inside, the story was careful, but the photos told the truth. The reporter's quotes, "I saw 2 men trying to disable what looked like a small arm gate," were printed. The county started asking questions. More importantly, neighbors started talking on a different level. This wasn't a petty property spat anymore. It was intimidation, potentially criminal. That word matters. Once you attach a criminal tone to someone's actions, you change the conversation. Suddenly, those who'd nodded politely at Richard's pronouncements felt uncomfortable about the men he'd allegedly sent. Suddenly, a petition to revoke the gate sounded less like civic duty and more like a cover for wrongdoing. The HOA, predictably, did what bullies do. It doubled down. Richard sent another letter, this time more threatening and more public, implying that the toll was extortion and that I would face legal consequences. He tried to pressure the county to deputize the board's claims. He even went on the local community forum, posting long defenses about neighborhood safety and property rights. His posts were full of buzzwords, but short on facts. That, oddly, was his undoing. The more he argued, the more his account required proof. He didn't have it. I did footage, witnesses, the reporter. The stolen generator. The men in the night with pressure mounting, the county scheduled a hearing to review the status of the access corridor. I showed up with my attorney, the reporter, and a thumb drive full of footage. The hearing room smelled like institutional varnish and stale coffee. Richard arrived with his own counsel, a more expensive type, and the board. Faces taut when the county official called the meeting to order. I felt oddly calm. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rights and record. It was about the principle that no group could quietly privatize a shared corridor. and then bully the man who'd been using it for generations. I presented our evidence: cameras, timestamps, neighbor testimony, payment logs. The county's eyes narrowed over maps and annotations. Questions were asked. Answers were fumbled. Richard's lawyer suggested a compromise, a mediated access agreement. With fees and regulated access, the board barked in unison, but the twist came when the county's maps were examined under closer scrutiny. The shared corridor was, in a technical sense, not under HOA ownership. Moreover, and here's where the county staff flipped through some old recorded minutes and found something the board had hoped would stay buried. The HOA had used the corridor as part of a community easement in their official filings to facilitate recent development permits. In plain English, the board had been treating the corridor as a tool for expansion and profit, while simultaneously trying to lock it down from a long-standing ranch owner. The room went quiet. That silence was the product of one simple thing: hypocrisy is not sustainable. When enough people are watching, the county couldn't ignore that the HOA had benefited from the very corridor it wanted to fence off to others. They couldn't, in good faith, back an organization that appeared to be contradicting its own filings. By the end of the hearing, the county made a temporary ruling. The fence had to come down pending a full review, and the HOA's request for injunctive relief was denied. The county also opened an inquiry into the board's recent permits. It was not a vindication. It was a doorway. Richard's face when the ruling was read looked like a man who had expected applause and instead found a mirror. His power had always been quiet and procedural. When procedure is interrupted by proof and community outrage, it erodes. People start to ask questions they'd been taught to avoid. That night, we celebrated not wildly, not noisily, just with coffee and a few beers on the porch. Joe slapped my shoulder and said, "You did it, son. You stood up." I wanted to say it was all strategy, that every move had been calculated, but that felt small. It was bigger than clever plans and cameras. It was about dignity, about a family's history that had been treated like a nuisance. Still, the fight wasn't over. Legal battles take time. Anger festers. Richard could still rally the board and come back with appeals. But for the first time since they'd put up that fence, I felt seen. The payoffs from the little toll continued to drip in donations, not extortion. I used the money to replace the stolen generator with a better one and to set up community cleanup drives that made the shed look less like a private toll and more like an authorized maintenance kiosk. Part of my plan had been to blur the line between provocation and service. People prefer being part of a community when that community visibly improves. And yet, beneath the small victories, a thought bothered me. Power structures don't just vanish because a county office looks into their records. They adapt, so I prepared for the adaptation. I kept filming. I kept letting neighbors know the truth. I kept payments going now, mostly voluntary contributions to a legal fund and a neighborhood maintenance account. The toll had become a symbol, a tiny, humming reminder that control comes at a price. For some, the price was money. For others, it was conscience. For me, the price was the time and effort to hold people accountable, and I was willing to pay that price. Asterisk. The county's ruling should have been the end of it. Fence down. Road open. Ranch life back to normal. But anyone who's ever dealt with an HOA knows bullies don't stop when you win one round. They come back angrier, craftier, hiding behind more paperwork. Sure enough, within a week of the hearing, I got another thick envelope in the mail. This one wasn't from Richard's smug hand, but from a law firm out of the city. Glossy logo, expensive letterhead. Pages of legal threats that sounded official enough to scare the average man into submission. Words like trespassing, nuisance, injunction, and damages. Their angle this time? They claimed my little toll gate, The arm, the shed, even the donation box was unauthorized construction on HOA property. They weren't just trying to block me now. They wanted me fined into the ground. I sat on the porch with that letter in hand, staring at the words until they blurred. My dog nudged my boot, sensing the weight I carried. For a moment, I thought about what it would mean to lose, to give in, to cut my losses and try to find another way to my ranch. Even if it meant carving a road through rocky hillsides at costs I couldn't afford. But then I looked out across the land. My grandfather's barn, my father's fields, the cattle grazing. This wasn't just property. It was legacy. And I wasn't about to let a pack of paper pushers bury that legacy under legal jargon, so I did what I'd done all along. I didn't fight fire with fire. I fought it with truth. My lawyer and I combed through their claims. And tucked away in the fine print, we found something interesting. The HOA had indeed registered the corridor as community use easement years ago, meaning it wasn't their private land. In fact, they'd even received county funding for road maintenance on that stretch, so the same stretch of gravel they tried to call private was technically public benefit property, meaning my use wasn't trespass at all, meaning their toll road argument just collapsed under its own weight. But here's the real twist. In the middle of all this, I got an unexpected call. A woman's voice, soft but nervous. "David." She said, "Yes." "This is Linda. I'm on the HOA board." I sat back, suspicious. She hesitated, then added, I shouldn't be calling. But I can't stay quiet anymore. Not after what they've been doing." Turns out, not everyone on the HOA board was on Richard's side. Linda told me she'd voted against the fence from the beginning, but Richard had steamrolled the meetings. He controlled the narrative, silenced dissenters, and bullied the quieter board members into submission. But the break-ins, the hired men in the truck, even some of the threats in the letters. She swore none of that had been voted on or approved by the full board. Richard's making these calls on his own. She whispered. He's using HOA funds without proper authorization. Some of us are tired of it. We just don't know how to stop him. I leaned forward in my chair, gripping the phone. "You're saying the president of the HOA is going rogue?" She sighed. "I'm saying he's abusing power. And if you can prove it, you won't just win your case. You'll take him down." That changed everything. It wasn't just me against a faceless board anymore. The cracks were showing. There were people inside the HOA who didn't want this fight. People who'd rather keep their peace than wage Richard's personal war. So I adjusted my plan. The toll gate wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a symbol, a rallying point. Every time a car stopped there, every time a neighbor handed over a few dollars with a grin, it reminded them of one thing. Richard wasn't in control. And little by little, people started talking. The quiet whispers at mailboxes, the mutters at community meetings, the side-eyes at Richard's polished speeches. Neighbors who once avoided me now nodded in solidarity. Some even dropped off home-baked pies with notes like, "Stay strong." The best part? Even the people who didn't like me, who didn't like the toll, hated Richard more. They resented the fines he levied for tiny rule violations, unapproved paint colors, flower beds an inch too wide, flags flown on the wrong day. They resented his arrogance, his iron grip. And suddenly, my toll wasn't the outrage anymore. It was Richard. But Richard wasn't done. A week later, Linda called again, her voice trembling. "David, he's planning something bigger. He's bringing it to the next board meeting. I think he wants to sue you in civil court personally. He's pushing for a vote to use HOA funds to cover it. If he succeeds." She trailed off. I knew what that meant. He'd tried to bury me under legal bills until I broke. But what Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly guess, was that I'd been saving every shred of evidence. The stolen generator, The video of the hired men. The contradictory county records, even Linda's statements, and I was ready. The board meeting was set for Friday night in the HOA clubhouse. I decided I'd be there, front row, with every neighbor watching. If Richard wanted to make it a showdown, I was going to make sure he couldn't hide behind his usual charm and buzzwords, because this time I wasn't the outsider. This time I had allies. And Richard was about to learn what happens when the man you thought you fenced out shows up with the whole community behind him. Asterisk, asterisk. Friday night came heavy with humidity. The HOA clubhouse sat at the end of the cul-de-sac like a smug little fortress, beige siding, polished glass, and a sign out front that read, "Private Meeting in Progress." I parked my truck right under that sign. Not to be rude, not to be reckless, but to make a point. This was my land's access we were talking about. My name on their agenda. My story twisting through their lies. If they wanted to make me the villain, I wasn't going to hide in the shadows. Inside, the clubhouse smelled of lemon polish and stale coffee. Folding chairs lined the walls, filled with residents. Some crossed their arms, some whispered, some looked plain exhausted. At the front sat the board members in a neat row, Richard dead center, polo collar stiff, jaw tight, his little court of allies around him. And off to the side, nervously adjusting her papers, was Linda. The meeting started with Richard clearing his throat and banging a tiny gavel on the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice full of false confidence. "We're here tonight to discuss the continued nuisance created by Mr. David Carter, the ranch owner who insists on obstructing our community road with his toll gate contraption." A ripple of murmurs. Some nods, some groans. He pressed on. "This board has been patient. We've issued letters. We've consulted counsel. But Mr. Carter refuses to comply. Therefore, I'm moving that we authorize full legal action. A civil suit, damages, injunction, everything we can bring to bear. And I propose we use HOA funds to pursue it." He sat back like a man expecting applause. But the room didn't clap. Instead, the silence hung thick. That's when I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, loud and deliberate. Richard's eyes snapped to me, narrowing. "You can sit down, Mr. Carter," he snapped. "You're not recognized." I ignored him. "If you're going to talk about me, you'd better let me speak for myself." Murmurs again. One older man in the back muttered, "Let him talk." Another woman added, "Yeah, it's only fair." Richard's jaw clenched, but he couldn't outright deny me without looking like a dictator. He gestured stiffly. 2 minutes. That's it. I walked to the front, papers in hand, and turned to face the crowd, not the board. You all know me. Some of you drive past my ranch every day. Some of you have paid a couple bucks at that little gate. And maybe some of you don't like it. I get that. It's unusual. It's inconvenient. But let me tell you why it exists. I held up one of the county maps. This road, the very road we're talking about, isn't private HOA property. It's registered as a community easement, which means I've had every right to use it. Which means the fence that went up was illegal from the start. Don't take my word for it. Take the county's. I clicked a small remote, and the projector Linda had quietly set up flickered on. On the screen, a still image from the county's records showed the easement highlighted in bright yellow. The words "Community Use Corridor" stamped right across it. Gasps, whispers. Richard jumped up. "That's out of context," he barked. "Those filings are out of context." I interrupted, my voice steady. "Then explain this." The next image flashed, a screenshot of the black truck at my gate, the 2 men caught in the floodlight. One tugging on the toll arm, time-stamped, clear as day. "This is what happened when I tried to stand my ground," I said, voice harder now. Not letters. Not polite debates, intimidation, sabotage. And if you think, making this up, ask the reporter who was parked right down the street that night. Heads turned. Sure enough, the same county reporter sat quietly in the back row, notebook in hand. He gave a small nod. The room erupted in chatter. People pointing, whispering, shaking their heads. But I wasn't finished. And here's the part you really deserve to know, I said, lowering my voice so the room leaned in. Not every board member agreed to these decisions. Some of them were kept in the dark. Some of them never voted to spend your money on fences, hired hands, or legal threats. One man's ego has been dragging this whole neighborhood into chaos. All eyes shifted to Richard. His face flushed crimson. He slammed his hand on the table. Lies, absolute lies. But then, quietly, Linda stood up. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger with every word. "It's not lies," she said. "I've been on this board for 3 years. I voted against the fence. I voted against harassment. None of us approved sending men to that gate. Richard has been making decisions without proper votes, using HOA funds without authorization." The room exploded. People shouted, some in disbelief, some in anger. The board members beside Richard shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a balding man with glasses, leaned away from him, suddenly unwilling to share his space. And in that chaos, Richard's control cracked wide open. I raised my voice over the din. "You can sue me if you want. You can waste more money chasing a man who just wants access to his family's land. But every dollar you spend comes out of these people's pockets. Every shady move you make leaves a trail. And every time you call me an outsider, I'll be right here, shining a light on the truth." I stepped back, folded my papers, and waited. The room turned on Richard like a tide. Residents demanded explanations. A few outright called for his resignation. Someone yelled, "You've cost us enough." Another shouted, "We're done with you, Richard." And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I saw it, fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, not fear of legal battles, but fear of losing the one thing he craved most: control. The board didn't vote that night on his lawsuit. Instead, under pressure, they tabled it. Then they voted to launch an internal review of Richard's actions, and just like that, the man who once strutted around with his polo collar stiff and his smirk unshakable suddenly looked small, cornered, and very, very alone. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Men like Richard don't go quietly, and something told me. He had one last play left in him. Asterisk, asterisk. I thought the toll road victory would finally calm the storm, but instead kicked off a wildfire. The HOA wasn't just angry anymore. They were desperate. They started sending out letters threatening legal action, accusing me of operating an unauthorized business and profiteering off residents. But here's the twist. I wasn't making a dime. Every toll I collected went straight into a transparent account, funding the road maintenance, security cameras, and a backup generator for the gate. I posted the receipts publicly. And suddenly the residents who were once skeptical, they were cheering me on. The HOA, though, wasn't giving up. They called an emergency board meeting. This time, they brought their heavy hitter, a corporate lawyer flown in from the city with a slick suit and sharper tongue. He looked at me and said, "Mr. Walker, you're in violation of multiple ordinances. You're running what amounts to a private highway. This won't hold up in court." I leaned back, calm as a man sitting on his porch after a long day of work, and said, "Funny thing about highways. They're public, but this is private property. My property. You put up the gate, not me. I'm just making sure it works." Efficiently, the room went dead silent. And that's when one of the residents, an older woman I barely knew, stood up and said, "The truth is, we feel safer with the toll road. The HOA has never done half as much for us as Walker has. If you want to fight him, you're fighting us too." The lawyer's smile faltered. The board members shifted in their chairs. For the first time. They weren't holding all the cards. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because HOAs, they don't back down easy. And I had a feeling their next move would be dirtier, meaner, and aimed straight at my livelihood. I wasn't just the man with the toll road anymore. I had become the gatekeeper. And the HOA was about to test how far I'd go to defend it. Part 8 ends here. Would you like me to continue straight into Part 9, where the HOA tries their most ruthless move, yet one that threatens not just the road, but the narrator's entire ranch? You said, continue straight into Part 9, ChatGPT said. Here's Part 9 of your 20,000-word HOA story script. Part 9, the HOA's ruthless move. Narrator male. Just when I thought I'd finally cornered them, the HOA struck back, harder than ever. They didn't go after the toll road this time. They went after me. One morning, I got a thick envelope in the mail. Inside, a cease and desist order, paired with a lawsuit claiming I was creating hazardous conditions, public nuisance, and, get this, emotional distress for board members. It was laughable at first, until I read the fine print. They weren't just trying to shut down the toll road. They were petitioning the county to revoke my ranch permits. If they succeeded, I wouldn't just lose the gate tide, lose my cattle business, my land use rights. Everything. That's when I realized this wasn't a feud anymore. This was war. I drove straight to the courthouse, slapped down the HOA's paperwork, and filed a counterclaim. But I didn't stop there. I called every resident who supported me, gathered signatures, and within a week, had a petition larger than the HOA's own membership list. The tide was turning. People were angry not at me, but at them. They saw through the lies, the power grabs, the corruption. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. During discovery, my lawyer unearthed internal emails between the board members. And buried in the chain was the smoking gun. The HOA president had secretly planned to sell part of the land around my ranch access to a developer. That fence. That toll road battle. It wasn't about safety or community standards. It was about money. They wanted to choke me, outforce me to sell so they could cut a deal behind closed doors. The moment that evidence hit the courtroom, the HOA's lawyer went pale. The judge leaned back and said, "Looks like this gate doesn't just block a road. It blocks a cover-up." I felt the ground shift under my boots. For the first time, it wasn't me on trial. It was them. But if I thought that was the end of it, I was dead wrong. Because when greedy people get cornered, they don't surrender. They strike harder. And the HOA was about to make their boldest, most dangerous move yet, one that would push me to my breaking point. I had no idea what was coming. But I knew one thing. I wasn't backing down. Asterisk. The HOA was cornered. Their secrets exposed. Their lies dragged into daylight. But instead of folding, they doubled down. Late one night, I was woken by the roar of machinery. I looked out my window, and my stomach dropped. A bulldozer contracted by the HO I was tearing into the fence line by the toll road. They weren't waiting on the courts. They were trying to demolish my gate by force. I jumped into my truck. Headlights cutting through the dark. Dust rising as I slammed to a stop at the road. The HOA president stood there, smug as a rattlesnake, barking orders like he owned the place. I shouted, "This is private property. You're trespassing." He sneered, "Not for long. By morning, this road belongs to the association again." But here's where the twist came in. What he didn't know was that I had already tipped off the sheriff's office. Between the emails we uncovered, the petition from residents, and the ongoing court case. Law enforcement had been watching closely. Blue lights flashed across the night sky. Squad cars pulled up, sirens wailing. Deputies stepped out, and the HOA president's smirk finally cracked. The sheriff said, "This ends tonight. Shut down the equipment. Step away from the property." For the first time, the HOA realized they weren't above the law. The bulldozer idled silent, the workers backed off, and the president was slapped with charges trespassing, attempted property damage, conspiracy to defraud. The residents, they rallied around me. People who had once been divided now stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding a vote to dissolve the HOA's corrupt board. Within a month, they were gone, removed from power, their scheme shattered, and the toll road. It didn't just stay. It became a community staple. We kept the system in place, but with fair rules, no profiteering, no hidden agendas, just honest upkeep for everyone's benefit. As for me, I got my ranch access back, my livelihood secure, and something even more unexpected: respect. Folks started calling me the gatekeeper, the man who stood his ground and turned an HOA's fence into their downfall. Looking back, I realized the truth. They tried to wall me in, control me, break me. But fences work both ways. Sometimes they keep people out, and sometimes they trap the ones who build them and the HOA. They built their own cage. Asterisk, asterisk. So, if you ever find yourself facing people who think they can fence you in, remember my story. Stand your ground. Don't let power-hungry bullies write your future, because sometimes the best revenge is making them pay the toll. Asterisk, asterisk. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you in the next one. Peace, asterisk.